America joins the war in 1917, and the cry goes up, too little, too late. They'd spent 3 years peddling a totally unrealistic peace proposals based on the so-called Brotherhood of Man. They joined at the last minute. They did very little. They're the only country to have made money out of the war. At the end of it, they're instrumental in setting up the League of Nations, which they then refused to join, thus laying the framework for another war in 20 years' time. That was said at the time, and it's been said since, but it is to completely fail to spot that this was not America's war. Why should it be America's war? Most of the population, or much of the population of America and or their ancestors, had left Europe to get away from religious persecution, civil war, invasion, mayhem, internecine squabbling, and they had no wish to get involved in yet another outbreak of European unpleasantness. The American Civil War had only finished 50 years previously, and the scars were still there. Most Americans were interested in nation building. They were looking inwards. They certainly weren't interested in foreign affairs. The Hearst Press, which was the major French major press organization in the United States, was openly pro-German. There was a sizable Irish element, which wasn't necessarily well disposed towards the British. And after the 1916 rising in Dublin, they were even less well disposed. In the Midwest, there was a German element. And while they weren't necessarily supportive of German aggression, they certainly weren't interested in going to war with their erstwhile compatriots. President Woodrow Wilson, who'd been president since 1912, when war broke out in 1914, he announced neutrality. He really couldn't do anything else. He thought the British were arrogant and patronizing. I can't imagine where he got that idea from. At the same time, he thought that the British system of government was the best way to run a country. He thought the idea of a prime minister in parliament was a good system. And his political hero was Gladstone. Relations between Britain and America actually deteriorated for the first few years of the war, largely due to the British blockade. Now, the blockade was a vital weapon of Britain's war-waging capacity. They blockaded France in the Napoleonic Wars, and they would blockade Germany in this war. The Americans objected to that. They were very concerned with the freedom of the seas. And when the Royal Navy stopped an American ship and inspected its cargo to make sure that nothing of value was going through to Germany, they protested. Many protests, either from the American ambassador in London or to the British ambassador in Washington. What the British actually did was that if an American cargo really wasn't going to help the Germans' war-making efforts, they tended quite often just to let it go through. And if it was carrying something that could help the German war-making capacity, the British often bought the cargo themselves. The Americans, of course, could never say that the blockade was illegal, because it wasn't. And of course, the British didn't sink ships and drown the crew, which later on, of course, the Germans did. In 1914, the United States was going into recession. And it was the First World War that got them out of recession, or at least postponed it for 15 years or so. British industry simply could not cope with the requirement to equip a rapidly expanding army. As we know, the British had to turn a tiny army into a huge mass army, and they had to do it very quickly, and British industry just couldn't cope. But there was a lot of slack in American industry. So the British were able to lay contracts in America for everything from clothing to ammunition to aircraft engines to guns to weapons to all the various bits of war-making material. And the British were also able to raise money on the American money market, which they could in turn sublend to the Russians, to the French, to the Italians. And it would only have taken a nod or a wink from the American government for those contracts not to be filled. and for the money market to dry up. And of course, the Germans complained. They said, you're supposed to be neutral. You're helping the British. This is totally wrong. And the Americans said, no, 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 no. We'll sell to you. But of course, you've got to come collect it, knowing full well that the Germans couldn't possibly collect anything across a sea which was dominated by the Royal Navy. As time went on, American public opinion started to become sympathetic to the British, but there was still absolutely no wish to enter the war. And one of the things that began to shift American public opinion was the German institution of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, from the German point of view, how do we win the war? The most important enemy is actually not the French, it's the British, not because of the tiny British army, which is still fairly small and will always be small compared to the size of the French army. It's British money and the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy dominates the seas. Before the war, the Germans were accustomed to importing a lot of their food from France and Russia. And of course, those sources are now closed to them. So they're trying to import food from overseas, and they can't do it because the Royal Navy is stopping them. Now, how do they knock the British out of the war? Well, they clearly can't invade Britain because of the Royal Navy. They can't do anything on the surface, but Britain imports 30% of the food that she eats. And a lot of it comes from America and Canada, some of it from Australia and New Zealand, and it comes across the sea. And while Germany can't do anything on the surface, possibly they can do something under the surface. So in February 1915, they announced that they're going to institute unrestricted submarine warfare. Now that means that any ship, regardless of the flag it's flying, heading for a British port is liable to be sunk. And on the 7th of May, 1915, the luxury liner RMS Lusitania was sunk by the German submarine U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant, that's Lieutenant Commander in our terms, Walter Schweiger. And he fired one torpedo, down went the ship, and 114 United States citizens were drowned. Now, the point about that was that the sinking of merchant ships in war was governed by something called the Cruiser and Convoy Acts. Now, that was an international regulation that had been signed up to everybody, the French, the British, the Americans, the Germans. And it said that it was perfectly legitimate to sink an enemy vessel. Neutral vessels, a separate question. Perfectly legitimate to sink a enemy civilian vessel, merchant vessel, but to do so, you had to give the crew the opportunity to abandon ship. And when all the crew had abandoned ship, or all the passengers had abandoned ship, they're all in lifeboats, then you could sink the ship. Now, of course, if you're a submarine, the only way you can tell the ship to abandon, the crew to abandon ship, is by surfacing. And at the beginning of the war, that's what the Germans did. A submarine would surface, they'd get on a tannoy, they'd say, abandon ship, and when everybody had abandoned ship, bang, bang, they'd sink the ship. But then the Royal Navy started to deploy Q ships. Now, Q ship was a merchant ship with a concealed gun. And it would look like a merchant ship with a cabin perhaps on the deck. Up would come the submarine, down would fall the walls of the cabin, which were merely plywood painted. There was a gun, bang, bang, submarine sunk. So from then on, the Germans perfectly understandably and perfectly reasonably started sinking ships from under the surface rather than on top. Lusitania goes down, 114 US citizens who are on it are drowned, and the New York Times publishes the following front page. And they say the Lusitania sunk by a submarine, probably 1260 dead, which was roughly about right, twice torpedoed off the Irish coast. Now, I said you'll remember that the U-20 fired one torpedo, and we know it was one torpedo, but there were two explosions. So, of course, the British said, well, they fired two torpedoes. In fact, the second explosion was ammunition being carried on the ship. The British claimed that it was a entirely civilian vessel. It wasn't carrying anything warlike, but in fact it was. It was carrying a huge load of ammunition, and that's what the second bang was. So although we know the Germans fired one torpedo, two bangs, the British say two torpedoes. It took the British until 1982 before the British finally admitted that actually the Lusitania was a perfectly legitimate target because it was carrying ammunition. I suppose by 1982, anybody who could possibly involve, who could possibly sue the British government was probably dead and gone. The submarine U-20, poor old Captain Zweig got an awful bollocking for doing it. He was told he shouldn't have done it. And his submarine, not at all connected, but eventually ran aground on the Danish shore in November 1916. Well, of course, when the Lusitania goes down, the Americans protest. And Germany in September 1915, they abandon unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, they're not going to go for neutral shipping anymore. They can still, of course, go for British shipping. Well, the Lusitania, I suppose, is the one we all know about, but of course there were others as well. 1916, the Germans once again announced unrestricted submarine warfare. And again, after American protests, they abandon it. 31st of January 1917, once again, they announced unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, again, they had said very clearly in all the major newspapers in the United States, they know jolly well that that'll probably bring America into the war. But the German thinking at this stage is that the war on the Western Front is stalemate. We are not going to necessarily win the war on land. The only way we can do it is knock the British out. This will probably bring America into the war, but we'll have won the war before they can do anything about it. The American army is tiny. Even if they can raise an army that matters, how are they ever going to get it over here? We'll win the war before that happens. America broke off diplomatic relations at this point. They stopped short of declaring war, broke off diplomatic relations, and Woodrow Wilson, the president, tried to get through what he called the Armed Merchant Shipping Bill. In other words, he wanted to put weapons on American merchant ships in order to defend themselves if they were attacked. And there was a filibuster in Congress by the lobby that didn't want this to happen because they thought this would drag America into the war. The bill was talked out and it didn't pass. Back in British waters, initially, the German submarines sunk an awful lot of British ships. And then the British did what they had done in the Napoleonic Wars and what they would do in the next war. They brought in the convoy system. And once they've got the convoy system going, then that means the submarines have to come to the convoy and the Royal Navy can sink them. What really swung American opinion towards the war was the actions by, that's the notice that they put. The Germans kept putting notices in American newspapers saying, look, there's a war on. Any ship in British waters is likely to be sunk. We suggest you do not travel on a British ship. And that was made very clear to everybody. So from the German point of view, if you travel on a British ship, that's your problem. What really swung American opinion was the actions of this man, Arthur Zimmerman. Now, Zimmerman was the foreign minister of Imperial Germany. He'd overseen the support for the rebels in Ireland. He'd had weapons smuggled to the Irish rebels. He'd overseen a policy of trying to seduce Indian soldiers from their allegiance, soldiers in the Indian army, particularly Muslim soldiers. In no man's land, they scattered leaflets opposite British Muslim battalions saying, why are you fighting the ally of the Caliph? Come and join us. The British Muslim soldiers were delighted because they could go out into no man's land, collect these pamphlets, these pieces of paper, which were very useful for rolling cigarettes and using them for other facilities, which we don't really need to go into in great detail. And he'd helped, of course, the communists in Russia to undermine the Tsar. And on the 16th of January 1917, he sent a telegram to the German ambassador in Washington. Now, President Wilson had been trying to persuade everybody to accept a peace, which he called peace without victory. Nobody was prepared to accept that, not the Allies, not the Germans. But of course, nobody was prepared to say we reject it out of hand. Everybody sort of pretended to be considering it. And the German ambassador said, Mr. President, we're very interested in your proposals. There is a problem. I am unable to communicate with my government because the British have cut all our cables. One of the things the Royal Navy did right at the beginning of the war in 1914 was that they cut all the German overseas cables. So the Germans couldn't communicate with anybody overseas except by mail, and any question of a German mail boat going off, that wasn't going to work because the Royal Navy would sink it. And wireless wasn't yet then sufficiently developed to really deal with sophisticated communications. And they said, look, I'm terribly sorry, said the ambassador, can't communicate. And the president or the Secretary of State said, well, I tell you what, Your Excellency, we will allow you to use our cables, the American State Department cables, provided you promise that you will only use them to discuss our peace proposals. And the ambassador said, absolutely, Mr. President, no doubt, crossing his fingers behind his back. And the German government, the German foreign minister, sent a telegram. And he sent it on the 16th of January. And this was a telegram from the foreign minister to the ambassador in Washington saying, strictly secret, yourself to decipher, we intend from the 1st of February, unrestricted U-boat warfare. It will be attempted to keep the United States neutral. If this should not succeed, we offer Mexico an alliance on the following terms. Mexico. Together we make war, together we make peace. Generous financial support and understanding on our part that Mexico will reconquer the lost territories of Texas and Arizona. Settlement details will be left to Your Excellency. You will inform the President of Mexico of the foregoing in strictest secrecy. And as soon as war with the United States is certain, the President of Mexico should be invited immediately to negotiate between ourselves and Japan. Please point out to the President of Mexico that ruthless employment of our U-boats now points to the prospect of England being forced to make peace in a few months. Acknowledged receipt, Zimmerman. So this is sent over the American State Department cables, coded, of course. Now, the British had been tapping the American State Department cables, totally illegally. America was a neutral country. They shouldn't have done it, but they were. And they picked up this telegram. And they'd also broken the German code, so they decoded it. So the British have got this. But how do they give it to the Americans without admitting that they've been tapping their cable? So they sat on it for 3 weeks. And then on the 23rd of February, they gave it to the American ambassador in London, Walter Page. And they said they'd picked it up in Mexico. They didn't obviously admit they'd been tapping the cables. And Page sent it off to Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson. Now, Wilson didn't entirely trust Page. He thought Page was far too pro-British. And he sat on it. And then after the defeat of the Armed Merchant Shipping Bill, which I talked about a moment ago, when Wilson is trying to put weapons on, defensive weapons on American merchant ships, and it fails, it doesn't get through. So he publishes the bill, or the telegram. So the telegram is now published. And people said, this is a fake, this is a forgery. And the Hearst press, of course, said, this is a typical devious British forgery. No international statesman would possibly behave like that. And for a while, it looked as if that was that. And then there was a press conference in Berlin given by the foreign minister, Zimmerman. And the Hearst press representative in Berlin asked the question. He said, Foreign Minister, I presume that the so-called Zimmerman telegram is a British forgery, expecting the Zimmerman to say absolutely. And he didn't. Zimmerman said, no, this is absolutely right. Yeah, we're making a very good offer to Mexico and to Japan. Now, that can only indicate either the man is criminally honest or has the most incredible arrogance. Because, of course, once that got back to America, which it did very quickly, then overnight almost, opinion changes. This is disgraceful. Mexico, Japan. Now, Japan was an ally of the British in the First World War, as you know, but the Americans were very worried about Japan. There were all sorts of laws then preventing Japanese settlement in California, preventing Japanese from buying land in California. They were very worried about the Japanese. They called them the Yellow Peril. And to the prospect of Germany threatening them with Mexico and Japan, absolutely, this was impertinent, disgraceful, shocking. Wilson addressed Congress, said that this was the most disgraceful behavior. And on the 6th of April, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. And they declared war on Austro-Hungary in the December. Woodrow Wilson, he was a Democrat, but he always said he was non-political. Of course, you can't be non-political as a president of America because it takes a huge amount of money and the backing of one of the major parties to get you. But he tried to be a non-political president. His background actually was in academe. He'd been the president of Princeton, which is one of America's leading universities. The president is rather like being the vice chancellor in this country, the man who ran the university. And he was very much trying to get this peace without victory. History is sort of divided on Wilson. Some think he was a genuine idealist who really did believe in the brotherhood of man and really wanted peace. Others think, no, he wasn't. He was a cynical stealer of markets, knowing that America could snaffle the markets that the British and the French could no longer service. I have to say, I personally think he genuinely was an idealist. I think he was rather naive, but I think he was an idealist. I think he genuinely did believe in the brotherhood of man. Now, we all know there's no such thing, but he did believe in it. So America now has declared war. If America is going to go to war, they're going to have to raise an army, and they're going to have to find somebody to command it. And the decision is that the American army, when it eventually appears, will be commanded by General John J. Pershing. Now, Pershing's grandfather was an immigrant from Alsace. Now, Alsace pre-1870 was, of course, part of France, and after 1870, it was part of Germany. He was a graduate of West Point, commissioned into the cavalry. He'd fought in the Spanish-American War. He'd fought in the Philippines. He'd fought in the Indian Wars. He was a member of the directing staff of West Point at one stage, where he was probably the most unpopular officer there. He was an absolute martinet. The standards of West Point actually were pretty high. He didn't think they were high enough. And he drove the cadets and really became hated. And it was there that he got the sobriquet, the nickname of Nigger Jack. And they called him Nigger Jack because he'd served with the 10th Cavalry in Cuba. Now, the 10th Cavalry were a black unit, all-black unit, commanded by white officers, because, of course, the American army was segregated right up until the 1950s. Now, the Nigger Jack was later mollified to Black Jack, but the Black Jack nickname followed him throughout his life, not obviously in his hearing. Now, the American army was tiny. It was only 120,000, smaller than the British army was in 1914. And there were only 7 major generals. The highest rank in the American army was, at that point, was major generals. Now, of those 7 major generals, Scott was the chief of army staff, Bliss was his second in command, Sharp was the quartermaster general. Barry and Bell were both said to have health issues. Now, what that actually meant then was that they were grossly unfit, grossly fat, incapable of getting on a horse and incapable of taking the field. And that left 2, which were Leonard Wood and John J. Pershing. And what swung it, I mean, they were both highly experienced, both the same age, 57, both well reported on. But one of the things, though, the major factor that swung it was that Wood was believed to have political ambitions. he was on record as criticizing the Democrat Party and criticizing Wilson's policies. Now, of course, the last thing you want is a political general who's successful in a war. So they weren't going to have that. And that left Pershing. What also, of course, helped Pershing was that his father-in-law was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. And when father-in-law knew what way the wind was blowing, he telegrammed Pershing, who was down on the Mexican border, the Rio Grande. And he said in the telegram, "Do you speak, write, and read French?" And Pershing, knowing well which way the wind was blowing, telegrammed back saying, "Fluently," which was a whopper of the most enormous variety, because he didn't speak a word of French, but he knew exactly what way the wind was blowing. So he was selected to command whatever the Americans can send across to the Western Front. His own career was extraordinary. Promotion in the American army was desperately slow. Congress was anxious to save money, to spend as little as possible on defense. There was no obvious enemy. The Spanish-American War was over, the Mexican War was over, the Indian Wars were over, and there were lieutenants in their 50s. American officers retired at 65 on 3/4 pay. Now, this is at a time when British officers, majors retired at 47, and lieutenant colonels and above retired at 52. He's a second lieutenant at age 26. He's a lieutenant at age 32, by which time in the British Army today, or American Army, would be a major. He was a captain aged 41. In the American Army or British Army today, you'll be a lieutenant colonel at that rank. And then Teddy Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt, promoted him from captain direct to brigadier general, missing out major, lieutenant colonel. Now, Roosevelt had seen Pershing in Cuba. Roosevelt had been part of a unit, a sort of militia unit called the Rough Riders. And Roosevelt had been the second in command. And he'd seen Pershing and he thought highly of Pershing. And so he promoted him, which he was allowed to do. The president could promote generals to general rank. So Pershing was promoted from captain straight to brigadier general, over the heads of 880 other officers who were senior to him, which must have improved his popularity enormously. So by 1917, he's the junior major general. As you can see from the chart there, he was a brigadier at 45. It takes him 11 years to become a major general. And then when he's sent off to France, he's made a general. And he was the junior, but I've explained he got it. And he was the right man for it. So off he goes. He takes with him a staff officers and some soldiers, about 120 altogether. Off they go, first of all, to England. They discuss matters with Willie Robertson, the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He's met by the king. Then he goes across to France. He spends some time with Haig and the BEF and some time with the French. And he never said, Lafayette, nous sommes voici, which he's often quoted as saying, Lafayette, we are here. Lafayette, as you know, was a young French aristocrat who thought that, liberty was frightfully important. And when during the American Revolution or the American War of Independence, whatever you want to call it, when their Frenchmen beat hard Germans, young Lafayette went across and became a general in the Continental Army. And he was actually quite a successful general. The Americans, of course, loved him because they wanted French support. Eventually, of course, the French do row in. And there are to this day a number of statues in various American cities to Lafayette. Pershing always denied that he said, Lafayette, we are here. He couldn't have said it in French anyway, but it may have been said by one of his staff officers. So when he's had a look round, when he's talked in England, talked to Haig, talked to the French, he cables back to America and he says, I need 1 million men to begin with, and I need 3 million men to finish. Well, of course, back in America, generals and politicians fell off their chairs because the American army at this stage, as I've said, was only 120,000 strong. It was tiny. Most of it was down on the Mexican border. They'd only just withdrawn from Mexico fighting Pancho Villa. it was down there that they got the sobriquet of doughboys, because the dust, the white dust of the Rio Grande would stick to their uniforms and make them all look like bakers' apprentices. The army owned 285,000 Springfield rifles, but they only had 150,000 rounds of ammunition, which was about enough for one brigade attack. They had 400 obsolete artillery pieces. They had 1,500 machine guns of various non-interchangeable varieties. The aviation section of the Army Signal Corps had 55 obsolete aircraft, of which they thought possibly 20 could actually take off. And they only had 35 pilots. So the only way they can create an army that's going to make a difference is by conscription, plus volunteers, plus the US Marine Corps, plus the National Guard, which was the equivalent of the territorial force. And you can see here how they did it. All the names are put in a hat, and a blindfolded, he was the Secretary for Defense, in fact, pulled out the names that they required. That was the first attempt. I mean, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, obviously didn't do all the balloting himself. They produced lots of lovely posters. I want you for the US Army, nearest recruiting station, fill in. I particularly like this one: destroy this mad brute, enlist in the US Army. Possibly failing to note that the guerrilla is actually a mild-mannered vegetarian, but let that go. One of the things the Germans thought was that even if it brought America into the war, which it now has, they'd never get their army across to Europe. How could they? In fact, they did. The Royal Navy moved 50%, just over 50% of them. The rest came either in German shipping, which had been in American ports in 1914 when the war started, and couldn't leave because, of course, the Royal Navy was poised just outside American territorial waters, ready to snaffle them if they did, and in American ships. So they get them over. It's interesting to look at the numbers. By the end of 1917, they've got just under 200,000. Now remember, the army's only 120,000 when they start. By the end of the war, they've got over 1,800,000. In other words, it's about the same size as the British Expeditionary Force. And had the war gone on for another year, it would be bigger than the British Expeditionary Force. And have it gone on for another 2 years, it would be bigger than the French army. But it's one thing to have the men. It's quite another to equip them. Pershing was very much taken with tanks. That's the Americans marching through London initially, because they went to UK, then across to France. There they are marching through France. Pershing was very taken with tanks. And he asked the British he would like some Mark V's. Now, unfortunately, Haig wanted to help, but he only had enough tanks for himself. He didn't have enough to give to the Americans. So they had to settle for the French Renault tank, which was a two-man tank, 6 tons, 50% of them with a 37mm gun and 50% with a machine gun. And they were pretty useless. Once they went into action, the Germans were actually able to knock them out quite easily. And of course, if you raise an enormous army very quickly, you do have problems. British have the same problems, 1914, 15. You have problems of training, you have problems of kit, you have problems of equipment. So what they settled for is French tanks, French artillery, the 75, which was actually really obsolete by 1914, but they had an awful lot of them. The British 18-pounder was much better, but of course the British had less artillery. They had the French Hotchkiss medium machine gun. They went for the Chauchat, the French Chauchat submachine gun, or sorry, light machine gun rather. It wasn't anything like as good as the Lewis. The Lewis was an American invention, but the American army had turned it down, and the British, of course, had grabbed it. So the Americans ended up with the Chauchat. They had British rifles rebored to take American ammunition, and British helmets. They had a problem with horses. Now, the priority was in moving men, not horses. And what the Americans hoped to do when they got to France was to buy horses from the Spanish. But the Spanish wouldn't sell them any horses, and the Spanish wouldn't sell them any horses because the Americans wouldn't sell cotton to Spain. And the reason they wouldn't sell cotton to Spain was they knew jolly well that if they did, the cotton would end up in Germany. So to give them horses to pull their guns, the British reduced their 6 horses per 18-pounder down to 4, so 2 of the horses could be given to the Americans, tied them over until eventually they were able to ship across horses from the United States. Some people said at the time, well, hang on, our industry is producing all sorts of stuff for the British. Why don't we simply switch production with the Americans? And actually, President Woodrow Wilson took a very sensible, very pragmatic view. He said, look, a shipload of ammunition delivered to the British will be fired at the Germans now. A shipload of ammunition provided to our army will not be fired until we are ready to go into action. And we don't really know when that's going to be. Well, as I say, there are all sorts of problems. We've got a huge number of men coming across, but all sorts of problems killing them. One of the problems was boots, for example. A lot of them had only civilian shoes because the cobbling industry wasn't able to produce enough boots quickly enough. So all sorts of problems. But private soldiers, as we know, if you strip away all the peripheries, you can actually train a private soldier relatively quickly, get them physically fit, get them used to carrying heavy loads and marching long distances, teach them to shoot, teach them the basics of military discipline, teach them minor tactics, and you've got them. And you can do that actually relatively quickly. It takes a lot longer to produce commanders. You've got to grow them. And the War Department back in Washington tried to stick to the rules of peacetime seniority. And all sorts of people were being sent out to Pershing to command divisions and brigades who were, many of them, totally unsuitable. But they either had political connections or they had seniority on their side. One of the officers sent out was a man called Hunter Liggett. Now, Hunter Liggett was 60 and enormously fat. And Pershing said to him, "You're too old, you're too fat, you're for home." And Liggett actually bearded the old curmudgeon and said, "Sir, give me a chance." And Pershing rather grumpily said, "You've got a month." And Liggett thought, how do I get fit? Now, unlike most Americans, Liggett had never sat on a horse. So he told his ADC, who was a rider, go and borrow 2 horses from the British. And Liggett got on this horse. He'd never sat on a horse in his life, and they went galloping all over the country, having the most spectacular falls. He broke a collarbone on one occasion. One occasion, he had quite severe concussion because he fell off. But he does manage to lose weight, and Pershing says, all right, you can stay. And it was as well that Pershing did take that view, because next to Pershing himself, Liggett was probably the best commander in the American army, and eventually he ends up commanding the first American army when it's created. The other side of the coin was a man called Major General William L. Sibert, and he was sent out to command the 1st Division. And this is the report that Pershing wrote on him: slow of speech and thought, slovenly in dress, has an eye to his personal interests without any ability as a soldier, utterly hopeless as an instructor or as a tactician, fails to appreciate soldierly qualities, having none himself, loyal as far as it suits his purpose, opinionated and difficult to teach, has a very high opinion of his own worth, signed John J. Pershing. So back went Sibert to Washington. Now, to be fair to Sibert, he was an engineer, and his last job was digging the Panama Canal. So it was probably a little unfair to expect him to be able to command a division. But there's a lot of that. And, you know, in Pershing's view, the Chief of Staff of the Army back in Washington doesn't understand my problems. And the Chief of Staff of the Army's view, Pershing doesn't understand our problems back here. But eventually, he does manage to get the commanders he wants and the people he trusts. One of the difficulties was that Congress was very reluctant to promote anybody. Now, in the American Army, then and now, promotion is in the hands of Congress. And the problem was, they thought, we've created this enormous army. And if we promote people, then when the war's over and the army goes back to its peacetime size, all these people obviously will have to be discharged and that we'll have to pay their pensions. So if we only give them local rank or don't promote them at all, then they'll revert to their substantive rank and we won't have to pay their pensions. And this meant that American corps, instead of being commanded by a lieutenant general, which they were in the British Army or the French Army, they were very often commanded by major generals. And quite often brigade commanders were actually colonels rather than brigadier generals. Pershing eventually gets round it, but it's a long, hard fight to persuade Congress that people ought to be given the rank and the pay that their appointment deserves. Now, as far as the soldiery were concerned, Wilson had made it very clear to Pershing that there was to be no military involvement whatsoever until there was an American army properly trained, properly equipped under American command, ready to go in. Pershing realized the realities of war, and he helped where he possibly could. He tended to say it was training. He did say that if he'd thrown 500,000 Americans in with the British in the 1917 Third Battle of Ypres, then the war would have been over. But of course, there weren't 500,000 Americans trained and ready in 1917, so it couldn't have happened. But he did help where he could. Battle of Cambrai, for example, he lent 3 engineer regiments to Hague under the guise of training, and they were very, very useful. The first time they actually fired a shot in anger was at a place called Chateau Thierry in May 1918. And what happened was that the French asked Pershing if he could put some troops in behind the French just to bolster them up, to help French morale. And Pershing agreed. They called it training. And a battalion of a motorized machine gun regiment dug in on the south bank of the Marne, and the Germans were advancing towards Chateau Thierry, who was on the north bank of the Marne. The French actually legged it out of Chateau Thierry. The division supposed to be defending Chateau Thierry was Senegalese, and as they streamed across the one bridge, passing the American transport that had been parked along the road, they looted everything that could move. The Senegalese were known as champion looters. In fact, the Germans never got across the Marne, and this cartoon was published in the American press, Chateau Thierry, the turning point of the World War. Well, that of course never happened. The Americans never got into Chateau Thierry. They didn't need to. They were on the other side of the river, so there was no fighting in the town the way it's depicted there. And of course, it wasn't the turning point of the war. It was a very minor skirmish. But of course, from the American point of view, this is the first time they'd fired a shot in anger. So of course, it's important to them. At about the same time as the Chateau Thierry incident was happening, the US Marine Corps again asked to back up the French behind them, which they agreed to do. And then again, the French withdrew without telling them. And the US Marine Corps found themselves in the front line. And they attacked Belleau Wood. And Belleau Wood is a major battle honor to the US Marine Corps to this day. They had problems. They were in the same state as the British were in 1916 with the new armies. All sorts of things went wrong. Officers didn't use their compass and got lost. The artillery either didn't keep up with the infantry or went far too far ahead of the infantry, but they did capture Belleau Wood. And one of the major American cemeteries on the Western Front is just the other side of Belleau Wood. And I know a lot of members of the Western Front Association will have seen that. The first formal action was at Saint-Mihiel between the 12th and the 15th of September 1918. Now, the Saint-Mihiel salient was this salient of German-occupied territory pushed out. And at this point was the town of San Miguel. And the idea was that the recently formed American First Army would take out the salient. But they weren't allowed to liberate the town of San Miguel, because that's where the French president, Poincaré came from. So that had to be liberated by French troops, which made the planning slightly complicated. And it was a complete success. The Germans, in any case, were about to withdraw back to shorten their line. And in went the Americans, a nice, clean operation, 3 days, over and done with. And it was a very good practice for them for what would come later. Because now they're going to be given their own sector of front, and that's going to be on the Meuse-Argonne. Now, again, Wilson was insistent that the Americans were not there as a poodle of the French, and more particularly not as a poodle of the British, which is why America never called herself an ally. She called herself an associated power. Now, to us, that's just semantics. What's the difference? But to the Americans, it meant that they didn't necessarily share the agenda of the British or the French. They were an associated power with their own agenda on their own command, and they weren't poodles of anybody. But they wanted to be as near to the French as possible rather than to the British. The British, after all, were the old colonial power. There were still very old men in America who remembered talking to other very old men who remembered the War of 1812, or if they didn't remember, at least talked about it. So they're going to have their own sector. Training, of course, goes on. The Americans, Woodrow Wilson thought that the French were far too defensive minded. And of course, they just got over the mutinies of 1917, and it was a very fragile army still. And Pershing thought they were far too defensive. He'd much rather train with the British because he thought they were much more aggressive. And that actually worked pretty well. The Americans preferred British rations to their own. That hasn't changed. There was a great racket going on in Afghanistan with British rations for American camp beds, their camp bed being better than ours. Their rations are known as MRE, meals ready to eat, or as the American soldiers call them, meals rejected by Ethiopians. So training went well, but there was a problem. In the British Army, every soldier in the field is entitled to 1 tablespoonful of rum a day. Now, a tablespoon of rum is not enough to get blattered or anything silly. It's a lovely little morale boost. And the British, of course, were giving this to the Americans. But the American army is dry. It was dry then, it still is in the field. And there were a number of people complaining to Pershing, saying the British are giving our men alcohol. And Pershing's decision, very sensibly, was as long as they're with the British, they should be entitled to the perks of their host. So they can certainly have their rum. Once they leave the British, of course, then it's back to American rules. As I said, they preferred British rations. They didn't like tea. But that was all right because they could provide it with coffee from American sources. So they move off up to the Meuse-Argonne. This is a distance of over 60 miles. They've got to go sideways, 60 miles. They've got to move the whole of the army. It's transport, it's artillery, it's field hospitals, its ammunition dumps, everything. It's got to be moved up to take over a sector in the Meuse-Argonne. And the whole thing is masterminded by a young staff officer called George C. Marshall, who's a substantive captain, acting colonel. And of course, it's George C. Marshall who becomes chairman, or chief of staff rather, before the Joint Chiefs were instituted. He is the chief of staff of the American Army in the Second World War, Roosevelt's major and chief advisor on military matters, and of course well known to the British because they remembered him as a young officer and his brilliant staff work in the First World War. So the British knew him, and that was very helpful in the Second World War. So they're there, and they have got their own sector. And that's going to be part of this final offensive. It's an offensive in which the Belgians were involved, the French were involved, the Americans were involved. It's the BEF that do most of the work. The French are still recovering from the mutinies, and the Americans are still learning. BEF do most of the work. But America was there, and what they did was done well enough. They are eventually stalled, but the Germans are pushed back, further and further back, and eventually facing starvation and possibly revolution at home, they ask for an armistice. Pershing and Haig thought they shouldn't be given that armistice. They thought the Germans are still on occupied territory. If they're given peace now, the legend will arise that they were never actually beaten, that they were stabbed in the back. We ought to go on, push them back into Germany, then allow them to have an armistice. Well, of course, that wasn't acceptable. Clemenceau, the French wanted a peace almost at any price. And Lloyd George, the British wanted peace as soon as possible. But of course, the legend of the stab of the back did arise. So Pershing and Haig were right in that sense. The Versailles Conference, Woodrow Wilson came across to France for it. You can see on that slide on the left, that's the Prime Minister of Belgium. And then next to him, the very dubious David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Then Tiger of France, Clemenceau, and then Woodrow Wilson. And of course, they do discuss Wilson's 14 points. The British and the French weren't prepared to sign up to all of them. Wilson wanted freedom of the seas. British weren't prepared to agree to that because the blockade was one of their principal war-making weapons, and they weren't going to admit that they wouldn't, or weren't going to agree that blockading couldn't happen. Neither the British nor the French agreed with Wilson's requirement or Wilson's wish for all nations to have self-determination, because the British and the French had large empires, which they wanted to hang on to. But the Versailles Treaty was eventually agreed. Wilson went back to America. He had a stroke in 1920, which was actually covered up. In the following election in 1920, he didn't stand. It was won by the Republican, Warren Harding. Warren Harding was a very popular president. And then he died in office in 1923. And once he was dead, all sorts of scandals of corruption began to emerge. The Teapot Dome scandal being the main one, the one we've all heard of, but there were lots of others as well. Congress didn't ratify the Versailles Treaty. The Americans, having been instrumental in setting up the League of Nations, they didn't join it. And they didn't join it because they were afraid it might involve them in a foreign war. It might drag them into a war they didn't want to be part of. And America reverts back in, not into complete isolation, but they give up every foreign entanglement that they think might endanger them. There were those in America who thought that the amount of money lent to the British forced America into the war on the grounds that if Britain lost the war, they wouldn't get the money. Therefore, America must go in. Now, that wasn't the reason why America went into the war at all, but it's what some people in America thought. And it did lead to the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1939, which said that America could not lend or provide or sell anything to a nation that was involved in a war of which America was not a participant. And that did cause problems for the British during the Second World War. Eventually, FDR manages to bring in Lend-Lease, which is a bit of a fudge. So what was the American contribution to the First War? Well, of course, its industrial capacity. That was very useful, very important. The fact that loans could be raised. Militarily, people like Marshall, MacArthur, Patton, Clark, McNair, all people who would be generals in the next war, had been on the Western Front. Whereas Eisenhower, Bradley, Devers hadn't been on the Western Front. Now, this did cause them some problems when Eisenhower had to command people who had been on the Western Front and thought they knew more about running a war than he did. It is true that America made money out of the war. the UK's golden dollar reserves reduced by 42 million in the First World War, and also lost a number of overseas investments, whereas the USA increased hers by 278 million. Of course, American troops also took part in Italy. An American regiment went to Italy, and in the Allied intervention force during the Russian Civil War. But of course, that's another story. Deaths, well, of course, American deaths were far less than British or French or German deaths, just over 100,000, of which less than half, 53,000 odd, were combat deaths. 63,000 odd were deaths due to disease, mainly what was called Spanish flu. Spanish flu hit the Americans particularly hard. Now, of course, that's not very much compared to the French of nearly 1.5 million military deaths, the British over 700,000 military deaths, the Germans very nearly 2 million military deaths. Could we have won the war without the United States? I'm frequently asked. I think that we could. I think that the Royal Navy would eventually have starved Germany out, but it would have taken a lot longer and it would have cost a lot more in casualties. And of course, if American industry hadn't been available to the British, would the French have been able to stand without this help of the BEF? I mean, after all, in 1917, during the French mutinies, it's the Third Battle of Ypres that keeps the German attention on the British rather than on the French. So on balance, I think we could have won the war without them, but I think it would have taken much longer and would have caused a lot more casualties. Thank you very much indeed for listening. And if there are any questions, I shall do my best to answer them.
Gordon, thanks very much indeed. That was tremendous. Everybody, if you'd like to raise your hands in the traditional way as a silent round of applause, I can confirm to Gordon that the hands are going up left, right, and indeed centre. So we've got a nice round of applause for you there. So it's now question and answer time, folks. So I can immediately dismiss quite a few questions because several people did actually ask the question that you answered right at the end. Would we have won without the American involvement? So that's immediately scrubbed quite a few of the questions there. So Francis, you're now live. Got your question in? Do you want to fire away with your question to Gordon?
Sure, Gordon. My question is actually more about the peace terms than about the war itself. But I teach a class in the United States in World War I, and I'm always fascinated by what seems to me to be a lot of attention in the peace process to what Wilson thought, Wilson wanted. You know, we have to wait till Wilson comes back so we can decide that, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are a lot of reasons possible for that. Gratitude is one, and money is another. But I wondered how you saw that. Do you see the Allies giving too much credibility to Wilson in the peace process, and why?
The peace process, both Pershing and Haig, thought that the terms of the Versailles Treaty were far too severe. It was the French that insisted on things like the demilitarization of the Rhine, the reparations, which there was no way Germany could ever have paid those reparations. It's not what Wilson wanted. It's not what the British, it's not what the British wanted either. But of course, the French had been invaded every generation. The Germans invade France. And it's they who insist on this very severe terms, which Wilson would never have signed up to. And of course, as you know, the Congress didn't ratify the treaty anyway. Wilson, I think, wanted to bring Germany back into the family of nations reasonably quickly, at the same time trying to bring in agreements that would prevent them going to war again. And it didn't happen. And of course, in some ways it's the severity of the Versailles Treaty that, plus the Great Depression, of course, which allows extreme nationalism to rise between the wars, and therefore the National Socialist Party gets in the Second World War. I think if the terms had been, if the French hadn't insisted on the reparations, I think the Weimar Republic might have survived. Now, the Weimar Republic was as democratic as Germany has ever been. And I'm now sort of taking a slight leap of faith here. I think that if the Weimar Republic had survived, I think the Second World War would still have happened, but I think it would have been France, Britain, Germany, and America versus the Soviet Union, because what everybody was terrified about in the 20s and the 30s was not Nazism, it was Bolshevism.
Bolshevism, yes.
That's what people were terrified of. But I think, going back to your original question, I think the peace treaty was not what Wilson wanted, not what he argued for. It wasn't what the British wanted either. This was the French. And I suppose if you're French and you've been invaded, as I say, every generation, you're desperately trying to find some way of ensuring that it's not going to happen again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Francis.
No, that was fine. I could go on for a half hour. Let's let other people get in.
Barb, do you want to start your video there?
I understand that Wilson more than likely had a very bad case of influenza himself, which had long-term consequences, both physical and mental for him, but that they directly impacted on the consequences or the ultimate outcome of the peace negotiations. In other words, he caved on some of his points that he was pressing on, and gave in to the French for their severity.
Yes, I don't think he could have done anything else. When he goes back to America, I mean, one of the reasons, of course, that Congress doesn't ratify the treaty and doesn't join the League of Nations, which might have happened anyway, but of course, he has a stroke, which may have been brought on by influenza, and that was covered up. It was never admitted that actually he was hors de combat, but it did mean that a lot could happen, which he couldn't influence. Now, of course, then a president could stand for a third term. Then it doesn't change, as you know, until FDR. But he did. But it's very unusual. I mean, I don't think anyone ever did except FDR. And of course, the election, as you know, is then won by the Republicans, by Warren Harding. I don't think Wilson could have insisted. He was trying to negotiate. I think what America didn't realize, perhaps, is that she had become a great power, but didn't really realize it, if you like, or had become a great power, but wasn't quite sure how to use it. And with the French being absolutely adamant that we're next door to Germany, you're not, and saying much the same to the British. British are a bit nearer Germany, but not quite so near. It was the French view that prevailed in the end, and it was always going to, I think. Wilson, I believe Wilson was an idealist. Not everybody does. I think he genuinely believed that there was such a thing as the brotherhood of man, that he could genuinely get reasonable people to negotiate together and make sure there was never another war. I being a cynical old soldier, think that human nature isn't like that. But I think he was a genuine idealist, and if all his points had been accepted, the world would certainly be a better place, but they were never going to be accepted, I'm afraid. I can't remember what the question was, but does that sort of...
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for your question there, Barb. Much appreciated. Good question. Andy Day, do you want to unmute yourself there, Andy?
And there we go. Yes, Gordon, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Much enjoyed it. My question, If we accept that the German army of September 1918 was very much a different beast to that of 1915-16, in the way it's wounded, very much weakened, would the US Army facing German army of 1915-16 fared worse than it did?
It's very difficult to say. They could not have gone into action in 15-16. I mean, they just didn't have they'd got the men, but they hadn't got the training, hadn't yet had the training or the equipment. And it really wasn't until 1918 when they were capable of going in. I think if they'd tried to put them in, I mean, as you know, the French theory was, the French said to the Americans, look, you don't need to have an American army. You just take American soldiers and we'll put them into French units. Well, that, of course, was nonsense. I mean, even if the Americans had accepted it, which of course they wouldn't, and you couldn't expect them to, what about the language? Now, the British had a more workable solution, but of course, politically, that wasn't acceptable either. And the British suggestion, which is what they'd done in the Peninsular War with the Portuguese army, they said, look, why don't we put American battalions into British brigades? And then when they've got a bit of experience, we'll form American brigades and put them into British divisions. And then we'll form American divisions and put them into British corps, and then we'll form American corps and put them into a British army, and then we'll form an American army. Now that would have worked, but of course politically it was out of the question. There was no way that the Americans could possibly be seen to be poodles of the British. So that was an unrealistic, it was a solution that would have worked, but was completely unrealistic and unacceptable politically. So I don't think the Americans were in any shape to go in 15-16. They were in 1918, but even in 1918, they were very much still rather like the British were in 1916 with the new armies. I mean, there was very much still learning. And as you say, of course, the German army had been weakened by 1918. Bolshevik propaganda, which had come back with prisoners who'd been released from Russian prisoner of war camps. The fact that although the German army was priority for rations, the rations weren't very good. In the Kaiserschlacht, which, as you know, runs out of steam, they're told, you know, one more push and the British are finished. The British are starving. Well, of course, they overran British ration depots and saw stuff they'd never seen in their lives before. And when you read some of the letters written by German officers, there's one who says, "I never thought I'd live to see the day when German soldiers wouldn't obey orders." Now that's so it had been much weakened. So I think really 15-16 couldn't have happened. 1918 very different.
Okay, thanks for that, Gordon. Thanks for your question there, Andy. Linda Wedderburn. Linda.
Hi, I think you've maybe covered a bit of it already, but I was wondering if the Americans took any advice from the British and French about tactics that the British and French had learned since 1914, because I understand that the British and French were fighting a different type of war in 1917-18 than they had done previously, but that possibly the Americans made some of the same mistakes that we had made at the beginning.
Well, they certainly did, and that's of course inevitable, because if you have an army which is inexperienced and only partially trained, now of course there was a cadre of people who did have experience, people who'd fought in the Spanish-American War, been in the Philippines, but the bulk was inexperienced. So of course they're going to make mistakes, but they did listen. The British and the French were fighting different wars. The French, with their mutinies, although they never called it mutiny, they called it acts of collective indiscipline in 1917, when they almost cracked completely. And the British then had to keep Third Ypres going on to keep the attention of the Germans. So by the time the Americans get involved, and Pershing says this several times, and he says it in his diary, he never intended his diary to be published, but in fact it was published. He says that the French are far too defensive minded. He'd much rather have his people training with the British, because the British are much more aggressive. The disagreement he had with, not disagreement with the British, but he thought training for trench warfare was a waste of time. They ought to be training for open warfare. And Haig is saying, yes, we hope, get to open warfare, but not just yet. So the Americans did have a problem when it came to trench warfare, because they had to fight some of that to begin with. Eventually, of course, the latter stages of 1918, it does become much more open warfare, but it doesn't to them. But yes, they did listen. They didn't always, sometimes, I mean, as Churchill said, two nations divided only by the language. There's one lovely report which I read in the, there's a very good American official history of the war, by the way. And there's a whole lot of letters published in it and reports. And there's a report by an American engineer officer of one of the engineer regiments lent to the British for Cambrai. And he says in the report, "I'm very worried about British morale. This morning, a British officer said to me, well, if the Germans want this bloody piece of France, they can bloody well have it." Not understanding, you know, British irony, if you like. So there's the odd sort of misunderstanding there, but they do listen to the British, and they do take account of it. But still, things will still go wrong. I mean, Belleau Wood, one of the major problems there was officers didn't trust their compass. It's a problem we have today when you're training young officer cadets. Trust your bloody compass, because everybody thinks, oh, the compass is wrong, I should be going that way. No, follow the compass. So officers weren't following their compass, and of course they were hiving off in the wrong direction and all the rest of it. But they did take Belleau Wood eventually, but with a lot of casualties. So the answer to your question is yes, they did listen to the British and to the French. And they did learn lessons, and they did follow them as far as they could. But one has to remember that, you know, it's a pretty steep curve that they've got to try and follow.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question, Linda. Right, let's
My carer has brought me a gin and tonic.
Why not? Okay, Phil Smith. Let's go to Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Is it true that the Americans instructed platoons to attack literally minutes before the 11 o'clock armistice?
Not to my knowledge, but I don't think it was ever institutionalized. It was never actually ordered, but there were a lot of cases, not just in the American army, but in the British and French and Belgians as well, of local commanders, I mean, at a very low level, saying, let's get stuck in before it all finishes. So there was a certain amount of that. I don't think it was ever, I mean, certainly having read the American reports, I don't think that was ever an official policy, but it certainly in all armies did happen. Some local commanders said, oh, right, fellas, let's keep our heads down and do nothing, which was probably the sensible attitude to take because they knew the war was going to end. Others thought, well, we better get stuck in and, you know, get our first blood, if you like, before it's all over.
Thank you.
Right, John Casey. Let's go to John.
Thank you. Thank you, Gordon, for that interesting talk. One thing I've never seen quite explained is why 8 months after declaring war on Germany, America declares war on Austria-Hungary. Was there a particular reason for them doing it and doing it at that time? Yeah,
they didn't, of course. The question of unrestricted submarine warfare, the Austro-Hungarians don't have a navy. Well, they do, but it's in the Adriatic. It's not in Western. So there isn't the same impetus to join to declare against Austro-Hungary, and they really only do it under pressure from the Allies, and also to make sure they're part of the peace process afterwards, so they could deal with the Austro-Hungarians. But they saw no reason to go to war with the Austrians, because the Austrians weren't sinking American ships, and it was the Germans who'd sent this, you know, who were trying to get Mexico and Japan into the war. So that was the reason. There were a number of countries of the minor enemies that, for example, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, but didn't declare war on Germany until quite some time later.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thanks for your question there, John. Right, okay, let's go to Anthony Davis. Anthony.
Hello there, Gordon. It's just a question about recruitment in the early days. Did they consider using the POWs method of recruitment, or when they took to the field in 1917, had they realised the the bad things of that, you know, whole towns being, men of whole towns being lost.
Yeah, they had learned that lesson long before we did. They learned that lesson after the American Civil War, where they had recruited on territorial basis. And as happened with our PALS battalions, terribly good for peer bonding. But once they go over the top and they take casualties, it all happens at a very small template. Everybody knows somebody who's lost a husband or whatever. And they took the deliberate decision that the regular army would be spread right across the country. The National Guard, as far as possible, was spread across the state. Now, the National Guard was a bit different than the National Guard. They tried to spread them right across the state. But of course, if you're training a couple of nights a week or weekends, you know, you can't expect people to travel 1,000 miles. And bearing in mind that I don't know how many times England fits into Texas, but it's quite a few times. And I know that Oregon is slightly larger than the whole of the British Isles. So there was a certain amount, but nothing like they had taken a deliberate decision. They'd never do that again. As I say, the Second World War, of course, the exception that everybody always quotes is the Virginia National Guard at Omaha, which had recruited on a fairly small basis. But essentially, no, they eschewed that. They deliberately decided they wouldn't do it. And they didn't.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Great, thank you.
Super, thanks for that. Thanks, Anthony, for your question. Stephen Rees. Stephen. Hang on, just unmute yourself, Stephen.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Gordon, thank you very much. Another fascinating, absorbing talk. Thank you. I'm sure I've read somewhere that once Woodrow Wilson had made public his 14 points, by, I think it was mid-September 1918, the German High Command let it be known to the Kaiser that Germany would get better peace terms if they tried to approach the United States because it was an associated power. And that's where that's where their eyes should be. First of all, they knew that France would give them a hard time. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that actually they put out, what's the word I'm looking for? Feelers towards the Americans. Yeah. First of all, to see what they say, because they were an associated power. So it's actually suited them at that time. Am I correct in that? Or
yeah, you're absolutely correct. They did put out feelers, and they did at one stage say that they would accept the 14 points. But of course, the Americans weren't, there was no formal, I mean, unlike the Second World War, where there was actually a formal written thing that there would be no separate peace. But the Americans were only prepared to negotiate as part of the whole. So they weren't prepared to agree a peace with Germany without the French and the British as well.
Understand.
So although the Germans quite sensibly, I think, tried it, it wasn't going to work. The Americans weren't going to have that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question there, Stephen. We'll go to Terry. Terry Jackson.
Hello, Gordon. Thanks very much for a fantastic talk. Just wondering, did many or any German Americans try to get back to Europe to fight for the Germans?
Not to my knowledge. The German minority in the Midwest were certainly cosseted by the German embassy. German embassy paid great attention to them, and they had German newspapers and German clubs. But I don't know of any of them. I mean, there may have been a few individuals, but I don't know of any major attempt to go back. I mean, they'd left Germany for one reason or another. And although they were Germans, they spoke German, read German newspapers, they really didn't see themselves as being part of the Kaiser's empire. So there really wasn't a problem about that. They didn't want to go to war with Germany, but at the same time, they didn't necessarily support, in fact, most of them didn't support German aggression. So they just wanted to keep out of it. Quite a few volunteered, actually. And of course, were used as interpreters once they got over there.
Okay, thanks for your question there, Terry. to unmute yourself there, Ian?
Oh, yes.
Do you want to fire away the question?
Yes. Well, to address Wilson and Pershing's decision not to embed with the French or the British and to have their own entire expeditionary force, what of the quote unquote colored regiments like the 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, a member of whom was the first winner of the Croix de Guerre, and so on. What about the racial tensions within the AEF that did allow such attachments in the case of Black troops? And could you speak to the racial tensions within the AEF and perhaps the Red Summer of 1919?
Yeah, the whole business of the British find it embarrassing, actually, the business of separate Black units. And of course, there were frequently about, do you mind if we have Black units in a certain area? Well, of course, we said, of course, it's part of the American army, you do whatever you have to do. It wasn't as serious as it became in the Second World War, when, of course, American troops stationed in England, American military law carried the death penalty for rape. British military law does not have the death penalty for rape, did not, and doesn't. So there were problems where the Americans wanted to execute a Black, and it's usually a Black, for rape. And the British said, well, hang on, you can't execute somebody. And there was great sort of argument about the statute of forces. The British, of course, had colored regiments themselves. The Indian Army, of course, was officered by British officers with Indian or Gurkha troops. But that wasn't quite the same thing. And the British really found the whole thing rather embarrassing and didn't really want to get involved in it. The French, again, had quite a lot of colored troops on the Western Front, Senegalese particularly. As for the tensions within the American army, I can't really speak to, I don't know the answer to that. The official history doesn't say, the American official history doesn't say very much about it. And I mean, there obviously must have been tensions, but at that stage in 1919, possibly it was accepted. It obviously wouldn't be acceptable now. Jim Crow laws and all the rest of it. Pershing's service with the 10th Cavalry is quite interesting because he liked them. And he said, and again, he says in his diary, they were every bit as good as white troops. So Pershing was not anti-blacks. Now, I don't think he ever suggested that segregation should stop, but he certainly wasn't, he wasn't sort of a Governor Wallace or anything like that. I mean, he's quite praiseworthy about them, both in Cuba and later on the Western Front. But as I say, as far as the internal workings, I really, I'm not qualified to answer that. I mean, as you know, it's only after the Korean War that segregation stopped, although the US Navy had enlisted blacks very much earlier, long before the army ever did.
Yeah.
You probably know a lot more about it than I do.
Potentially. I am doing a project on the Harlem Hellfighters, but
yeah.
But there is, the Red Summer of 1919 was when at least 17 and probably many more returning Black soldiers were immediately lynched upon coming back to their home communities. And it's a very, they were conscripted, sent over, fought valiantly, and then got the noose.
Yeah.
It's kind of a dark chapter in our history.
I mean, it's you see, if you go further back, the whole business of recruitment of Black soldiers in the Civil War is a fascinating subject of its own. Yeah, it's a problem. It's still with us in a sense. I mean, although there's no bar, of course, but there is, racism is still there in our society and in yours. It's there, and it probably always will be.
I know it was very contentious during the Second World War that Americans asked to set up color bars for the black and white troops in Britain.
Yeah, the Brits wouldn't allow that. Certainly the Republicans, the chaps who owned pubs wouldn't allow it. The Pope asked the Americans not to station black troops in the Vatican, which is interesting. The Pope is supposed to be the head of a major religion. All men are equal. Whatever. Yeah. I don't want to get into.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, look, it's now 9:30. I'm going to go to the very last question, Paul.
Hi, Gordon. Really good talk. Really well put together. Very interesting. My question is just following a bit on from Terence's question earlier. To what extent, when America declared war in 1917, was there any active protest from the German population or even Irish population in America at that time? Something that the Americans have been very conscious of in 1914 and trying to protect that side of the population. I just wondered to what extent were there actually active, even riots or whatever, anti-war protests in that community.
There weren't so much riots, but there was a lot of anti-war, not necessarily anti-British, but anti-getting into the war, from some very influential people. I mean, the Armed Merchant Shipping Bill was talked out in Congress. It was filibustered by those who didn't want to get involved in the war. What swung it was the Zimmerman telegram. After that, nobody, whether Irish or German or whatever, could actually say, we shouldn't be going into the war. I mean, here is Germany saying to Mexico, you can have Texas and Arizona back. Japan, you can, I mean, that was what really swung it. If that hadn't have happened, would America have come into the war? Oh, probably eventually. But that was the catalyst, really. I mean, they were moving towards that with unrestricted submarine warfare and whatnot. But then the Zimmerman telegram, no American could possibly accept that. So
irrespective of their, whether they came from sort of German background or whatever, they still would have supported or they didn't not support it.
They didn't actively oppose it. Yeah, they didn't actually oppose it. I mean, there were lots of people who thought we shouldn't be involved in foreign wars. I mean, nothing to do with Germany or China or anybody else. We, as a matter of principle, we shouldn't be involved in foreign wars. And of course, America is one of the few countries that could actually pull up the drawbridge then and could survive. Okay, they might not be able to import champagne or Gucci scarves, but I mean, America produces enough herself to survive, and she could then. So there was that lobby. Don't get involved in anything foreign. Teddy Roosevelt and Cabot Lodge, of course, were the two that said no, America should be on the world stage, but yeah. So there was a lobby that says don't get involved in any foreign entanglements, but there was certainly no open opposition to going to war in 1917. Not once the Zimmerman telegram had appeared.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your question there, Paul. Thanks, Gordon, for everybody who's enjoyed that. Please put your hands up as opposed to together. Gordon, the hands are going up electronically there. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I'll keep the thanks brief simply because I'm buffering. So one and all, we'll be back again on Monday with another lecture and again a week today. So hopefully you'll come back to join us for the WFA's webinars. Gordon, finally, many thanks indeed for your efforts tonight. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know that everybody who's watched has also enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Not at all. It's a great pleasure to talk to an educated audience. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Thanks everybody for watching. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on The officers get all